Thanks very much, Chris. So I want to start by noticing a basic homology parallel between the ontological structure of algorithms and the institutions of the modern bureaucratic state as they emerged at the end of the 18th century. So I want then to focus on the moment of the emergence of modern bureaucracy in the functionalist sense described by Max Weber. Any computational algorithm that's powerful enough to merit our attention, that's to say that involves the repetition or looping of calculations, consists of two distinct types of coded instruction, as Martin Oeg explains. So control structures, which decide which instructions are to be performed and how often, and ordinary instructions. These two basic types of coded instruction allow the algorithm to control its own operations and to work with the data which is fed into it. The ordinary instructions specify the operations to perform on the data, and the control structures specify, broadly speaking, how often those operations are to be repeated. Operationalizing an algorithm thus involves letting the algorithm loose to govern the data that it processes, and through its control structures to govern the way that it governs that data. So in this way, algorithms not only rule over the data that they process, but by virtue of their control structures, they exercise self-rule over their own operations. And here then is the other half of the homology or parallel. So when France's Constituent Assembly voted late in the night of the 4th of August, 1789, to abolish feudal privileges and venal office holding, they voted to dismantle the larger and less efficient part of French state administration. In the early 1790s, they set about redesigning the smaller, more efficient, already proto-bureaucratic part to serve the needs of the modern French state. Much of this work of redesign involved drawing up the type of organizational charts showing the relationships connecting roles and responsibilities, which are still a very familiar feature today in all manner of state and private organizations. The abstracting diagrammatic form of these charts both expressed and fostered a functionalist understanding of administrative office holding under both expressed and fostered a functionalist understanding of these new institutions of state, supplanting a personalized conception of administrative office holding that held under the Ancien Regime. So these organizational charts also expressed unprecedented concern for the way in which the various component features of the bureaucracy fitted together. In other words, how the institutions governed themselves, as much as how they governed the citizens and the objects in the wider world that they've been set up in the first place to administer. The modern bureaucratic institutions of state that emerged in the 1790s and which were consolidated under Napoleon, who was a proliferator and not really an innovator in this regard, these were all marked by the principle that I call double government, whereby internal self-rule was an important part and integral to external rule. So flagship Napoleonic institutions bequeathed to modern France, ranging from the Conseil d'État, the relaunched Conseil d'État, to the Cour des Comptes, can all be understood in these terms. Now, I've drawn your attention to this homology, this parallel between the double government exercised by the algorithm and by the modern bureaucratic institution for two reasons. First, because it suggests that algorithms as ways of simultaneously ordering the world and ordering themselves can be situated within a much longer history of administrative thought and practice. This is important because it counters the presentist, techno-fetishist euphoria that characterizes most discourse on algorithms today, let's say 90% of the conversation. Second, because I wanted to begin the paper for our colloquium on autonomy on non-anthropocentric ground with two examples of rational self-rule, so the algorithm with its control structures and the bureaucratic institution characterized by double government, which are already at several degrees of abstraction from persons, before turning, as I'm going to now, to Kant's conception of moral autonomy as self-rule. On the eve of the French Revolution, Kant outlined his conception of the autonomous moral subject, or specifically the autonomy of the rational will, in the groundwork and the critique of practical reason, so in 1785 and 1788. And for the purposes of today's paper, I'm going to take this account largely as read. Now, because Kant's conception of moral autonomy has been fundamental to still dominant ideas of the modern liberal subject and their moral and legal responsibility, there's a vast literature on this area, and I'm not going to engage with it extensively here. But I do want to zero in on several forms of abstraction which characterize the categorical imperative, the principle of moral action. It concerns, Kant writes, not the matter of the action or what is to result from it, but the form and the principle from which it does itself follow. And the essential good in it consists in this disposition, let the result be what it may. Kantian moral action is abstracted then in several ways, from the particular inclinations and interests of the agent, as well as from the consequences of the action. And moral action is only possible in the first place, according to Kant, because the transcendental subject is able to decide in abstraction from the realm of material causality. At least this all works anyway in theory, as Peter was suggesting yesterday. Similarly, Kant's kingdom of ends is only conceivable if one abstracts from the personal differences among rational beings, and likewise from all content of their private ends. So these several types of abstraction have been questioned most probingly by feminist philosophers, and more recently also from the perspective of recognition theory by Axel Honneth and others. In their overview of feminist critiques of the Kantian liberal conception, Catriona Mackenzie and Natalie Stolger point in particular to the abstraction of autonomous man underlying these accounts. In contrast, their feminist conception of relational autonomy is intended to afford greater positive value to relationships of care, I think in a positive sense and not in a kind of sinister sense that Charlotte was outlining a second ago, of care and dependency in the formation of moral subjects, as well as to other dimensions of subjectivity beyond the rational and the narrowly cognitive. In several key respects, these feminist critiques of Kantian autonomy as the kernel of the liberal subject, which are directed primarily against its problematically abstracted character, particularly its abstraction from embodied existence, from relational, socially embedded life, and its construal of moral decision-making in terms of abstract rational calculation. These critiques, they converge in striking and significant ways, I think, with critiques of contemporary algorithmic or computationalist thinking. For example, as David Golombier deploys this term. Now, this convergence of critiques, and by implication of their objects, computationalist or algorithmic thinking and Kantian liberal autonomy, can be put down in loose terms to the debt of both to Enlightenment high rationalism. But I want to emphasize their convergence around what we might call bad abstraction. In algorithmic governmentality, and here again, I'm afraid I'm going to take the concept largely as read, the abstracting process works by taking data harvested, which is to say abstracted from subjects who leave traces, usually unwittingly, when they interact with digital platforms, or increasingly with sensors embedded in objects in their material environment. And by recombining these abstracted data as abstract sets of correlated relations, including profiles. So Antoinette Rouvroy and Rouvroy Berns don't speak of abstraction as I do here, but one of my main points today is that I think there's much to be gained by conceiving of algorithmic governmentality in terms of abstraction and in relation to various types of philosophical and indeed anti-philosophical abstraction. But they do, however, and rightly, place great insistence on the fact that, as Deleuze noted, techniques of this type don't engage subjects or individuals of the familiar Kantian liberal autonomous type, but rather operate at a dividual or infra-individual level, and thereby tend to circumvent subjectivation and evade democratic deliberation. That's to say, they're not at all conducive to the responsive development of a genuinely emancipatory politics, although they lend themselves very well to all manner of insecurity management operations and political manipulation. I'm thinking of drone strikes and Cambridge Analytica paradigmatically. Thinking about algorithmic governmentality in terms of abstraction helps to establish much more convincingly its precise function within neoliberal capitalism. Marx remarked of his day that we are dominated by abstractions, and the commodity form about which his mature thought revolves is abstract, and abstractness governs its whole orbit, as Alfred Sohn-Rettel emphasizes. Sohn-Rettel's theory of real abstraction, as he calls it, attempts to offer a materialist philosophical derivation of abstract thought itself, including above all the transcendental Kantian subject and its autonomous will and pure reason. To derive this from what really happens, although not what happens in the heads of those involved, but what really happens in commodity exchange. Now, I can't do this theory justice here, and I don't want to pretend either that it's uncontested, but these samples give you a flavor of his argument. The second quotation on the slide particularly is the one I think I'll focus on. So the exchange equation abstracts quantity in a manner which constitutes the foundation of free mathematical reasoning. So it's no accident, Sohn-Rettel argues, that mathematical reasoning, as opposed to measurement, which is something he sees as a different activity, mathematical reasoning emerged in Greece in the 7th and 6th centuries BCE, just at the moment when commodity exchange was first being facilitated by way of coined money. So Pythagoras follows in the wake of coined money. Sohn-Rettel's argument then is that mathematical and other forms of rationality emerge from the categories implicitly required by exchanges of commodities in order to conceive of these commodities as being of commensurate value. So at issue here is the social commensuration of labor in the guise of commodity value and of money. Sohn-Rettel's theory of real abstraction helps to elucidate algorithmic governmentality in the following way. Just as in commodity exchange, the abstractness of the real action is hidden from those involved in the exchange, who are likely thinking about the very concrete use values of the commodities. For instance, about the tastiness of the tomatoes that I bought at the market and I'm going to eat for lunch. So in algorithmic governmentality, data is abstracted or harvested from subjects while they're preoccupied with other things. For instance, clicking like on some inconsequential social media post by a friend or acquaintance. So when this and myriad other data traces are processed and recombined into abstract profiles, the correlations established by the machine are based on the mathematical abstract reasoning which first originated in commodity exchange facilitated by coined money, according to Sohn-Rettel. So if the real abstraction of commodity exchange was the material origin of many of the basic categories of abstract thought, algorithmic governmentality produces and trades in what might be called by contrast hyper abstractions, or abstractions at a higher level. I suspect that Louis Althusser's conception of types or levels of generality will be helpful here in situating these hyper abstractions and relating them to other levels of abstraction and the materiality of the world. But today I want to focus instead on two other dimensions of Althusser's later thought. And first is his materialist critique of the enmeshment of idealist philosophy, that's to say most philosophy, in juridical modes of thought. And second is his more positive conception of abstraction, which I think is something we urgently need to be able to think about algorithmic governmentality. I just want to signal a debt to Alberto Toscano's two very useful articles from the mid-2010s, which reminded me, after having been submerged in Rancière for a long time, of why Althusser was still important after all. So the remedy for the worst excesses of algorithmic governmentality prescribed by Bernard Stiegler was to bring its factual operations within the sphere of new law. And of course, to some extent, the EU's new general data protection regulations reflect the traction of this argument with policymakers. But from an Althusserian perspective, there's reason to be very skeptical, philosophically or anti-philosophically skeptical, about the faith that this move places in bourgeois law. In Être marxiste en philosophie, a book written in the mid-1970s but not published until 2015, Althusser argued that the final destruction of feudal society in continental Europe in the late 18th century required a new juridical conception of the subject, which bourgeois law borrowed from Roman law. Now, this conception of the subject was juridically necessary for the organization of the emerging mode of capitalist production, in particular, the sale by the worker of their own labor power. And it was this juridical conception of the subject which philosophy, and above all Kant, took it upon itself to develop. Of course, Althusser's anti-humanism is well known, and I'm not pretending to have rediscovered today the death or deconstruction of the subject, something that in this and in many other guises has been going on in continental philosophy for, well, at least for half a century. But what I think is significant about Althusser's argument is that it encourages us to be skeptical about the recourse to liberal bourgeois law as a response to algorithmic governmentality, because this move constitutes a historical reversion which presupposes a disavowal of the complicity of liberal bourgeois law and its autonomous liberal subjects with the philosophico-juridical organization of capitalist domination in the modern world. Althusser referred to the juridical ideology from which modern philosophy has never fully emerged, an ideology required by the bourgeois mode of production and domination. And Althusser adds that by the end of the 18th century, the philosophico-juridical subject of bourgeois modernity had already been founded, and history moved philosophy on to a new phase. This then was the moment of philosophy's entanglement, less with the juridical than with the organizational. Althusser doesn't give this moment and the way of thinking that it spawned a name, by contrast with juridical ideology, but I do think we need to give it a name. And in light of the references to Saint-Simon, I think it's clear what Althusser means. So I propose to call this the moment of administrative or bureaucratic ideology, or more simply, that of the bureaucratic ideal. Even if one accepts the broad framework of Althusser's history of modern philosophy, neither of, and many people don't, of course, neither the juridical nor the bureaucratic ideologies simply disappear when their originating heyday passes, but they rather continue to haunt philosophy and the wider culture. It's very clear that the juridical has continued to haunt philosophy. And if you read much of the work on autonomy from the liberal tradition, particularly in analytic philosophy, this spectre is still evidently in rude health. But the haunting of modern philosophy by what I've called bureaucratic ideology, by the bureaucratic ideal, is less well understood theoretically, and is something that I'm seeking to describe in my own work. And I would suggest that until this haunting is understood, there's little hope of our being able to conceptualize political responses that go to algorithmic governmentality, that go beyond regressive reliance on a bourgeois system of law, bound up with domination and committed to a form of autonomous subjecthood, so beset with other problems. And as anyone who works in or has engaged recently with any institution whatsoever will have noticed, the juridical response in the form of new data protection law has triggered a proliferation, a veritable avalanche of bureaucratic regulation within organizations and at their borders. Regulation that makes all of our lives much more complicated and far more controlled by rigid process and procedure. And arguably, I think this is far too high a price to pay for the restoration of a modicum of legal control over the way that our data is collected and used. What's urgently needed today, I would suggest, is a radical political response to algorithmic governmentality, above and beyond the juridical response that consolidates bureaucratism, and indeed a response that counters the proliferation of bureaucracy that's a feature of neoliberal capitalism, as thinkers as diverse as Wendy Brown, David Graeber, and William Davis have noted. And I've got an article about that coming out soon. There it is. So central to that political response to algorithmic governmentality has to be, I would argue, a more positive conception of abstraction than has been evident hitherto in this paper. A conception such as we find in Althusser of abstraction as integral to thinking. Such abstraction would enable reflection on algorithmic governmentality. Now, of course, computationalist enthusiasts in government, and there are plenty of those, particularly in the UK at the moment, commercial interests in industry, and almost every institution seek in manifold ways to engineer our obligatory intimacy with algorithmic technologies. Even more problematic still is the way in which subjects begin to think like algorithms, by turning themselves into ranking animals who classify their experiences of 2020 from best to worst and other such meaningless rankings, or who are unable to think about the world in detachment from the narrow bureaucratic proceduralism which is increasingly colonizing even middle-class labor, especially, one might add, in universities. We need to be able to abstract from these forms of convergent intimacy in order to think about these technologies and respond to them politically, which also means to use them politically. This involves working at an even higher level, I would suggest, of theoretical abstraction than that of the hyper-abstractions in which these technologies trade. So algorithmic systems are abstract machines increasingly deployed across society to quietly produce rational order. They produce abstractions or hyper-abstractions, and they are run on abstract machines, on computers. But when they're operationalized for government, as they increasingly are, they produce very concrete, very divisive results, as Louise indicated in her keynote. I've argued that to think algorithmic governmentality and to respond to it politically, we need to understand it in terms of abstraction. And I've briefly explored several pertinent conceptions of abstraction. I've suggested that an adequate political response must avoid the pitfalls of juridical and of bureaucratic ideology. Kant's autonomous and rational moral subject was also, in a sense, already an abstract machine, equipped with an algorithm or a rational recipe for ruling itself and determining its course of action, even if, as Hegel noted and many others have objected since, its code wasn't really up to the task. Thank you.